Most people stand at the meat counter like they are choosing from 100 completely different jobs. Like one roast for Sunday, another cut for tacos, another for burgers, another for steak night, another because it was on sale, another because the name sounded premium. Then half of it sits in the freezer, gets forgotten, or gets cooked with the wrong method and disappoints anyway. My name is Marcus, and after years around butcher counters, I can tell you this. Most families do not need 10 different cuts of beef in the freezer. They need 3 cuts that cover 3 different jobs. One cut for slow, comforting meals that can stretch across several dinners, one fast, reliable protein for weeknights, and one real steak for the nights when you want something special. If you choose those 3 for versatility and value instead of hype, you can cover most of the beef meals a normal household actually cooks while spending less and wasting less. The 3 I would build around are chuck roast, ground beef, and ribeye, with chuck eye as the cheaper steak shortcut. That is not me saying every other cut is bad. It means the others become optional instead of automatic purchases. And that difference matters because grocery stores make a lot of money when you buy meat by name instead of by function. The first cut is the one I would trust to do more jobs than almost anything else in the case, chuck roast. But before I tell you why, look at your own freezer for a second. How many packages are in there because you had a specific plan? And how many are there because the label, sale tag, or fancy cut name talked you into buying before you knew what dinner it was going to become? That little difference between planned meat and impulse meat is where a surprising amount of grocery money disappears. Before we get into it, subscribe if you want more practical butcher knowledge that helps you buy meat for what it can actually do, not for the name printed on the label. I want you to know which cuts earn their space in your freezer, how to cook them the right way, and where you can stop paying extra for a job a cheaper cut can do just as well. If that saves you money every week, then this channel is doing exactly what it should. Chuck roast comes from the shoulder, the chuck primal, a part of the animal that works hard. That means the muscle is full of connective tissue and collagen. Raw or cooked too quickly, it can be tough. Cooked the right way, that same collagen turns into gelatin, and the meat becomes rich, silky, and easy to pull apart. This is the first butcher principle I want you to remember. Price often reflects tenderness more than flavor. A naturally tender muscle usually costs more because you can throw it over heat and eat it quickly. And a working muscle may cost less because it needs time. That does not mean it has less beef flavor. In fact, chuck can have tremendous richness when you let the cooking method do its job. Put it in a Dutch oven with onions, stock, and vegetables, and you have pot roast. Cut it into chunks, and you have beef stew. Braise it with red wine and aromatics, and you have something that tastes like it came out of a French bistro. Cook it until it pulls apart, and you have shredded beef for tacos, burritos, sandwiches, nachos, or rice bowls. Cool the leftovers, and the next day they become a completely different meal. That is what I mean by versatility. One roast can feed the family once, then feed them again in another form. And if you have a grinder, chuck gives you another trick. You can grind it yourself. Chuck is the foundation of some of the best ground beef because its natural fat and beef flavor work beautifully around an 80% lean, 20% fat target for burgers. So one whole chuck roast can replace a pot roast, stew meat, shredded beef, some brisket applications, and even packaged ground beef. That is a lot of jobs for one cut. The cooking method is simple, but people rush it. Chuck wants low and slow with moisture. In a slow cooker, give it roughly 8 to 10 hours on low. In the oven, around 3 to 4 hours at about 325 degrees Fahrenheit or roughly 160 degrees Celsius, with enough liquid to create a braising environment. Season it generously because this is a large piece of meat, and do not panic when it feels tight halfway through the cook. Collagen needs time before it softens. A chuck roast that is tough after 2 hours is not always overcooked. Often it is simply not finished. Give the connective tissue time to break down and you will feel the difference. When a fork begins sliding in easily and the meat starts separating with little effort, you are getting there. If you slice rather than shred it, pay attention to the grain and cut across it. Shorter muscle fibers mean a more tender bite. Chuck can also replace brisket in plenty of braised or shredded recipes where smoke and bark are not the entire point. If your goal is tacos, sandwiches, or a rich pot of shredded beef, chuck is usually easier, cheaper, and more forgiving than buying a whole brisket. It can replace bottom round or rump roast when you want more richness. And if you normally buy pre-cut stew meat, buying chuck and cutting it yourself gives you more control over size and often better value. Tell me in the comments what you use chuck for most: pot roast, stew, tacos, or homemade ground beef. I am curious because this one cut probably has more family traditions attached to it than any expensive steak. The second essential cut is ground beef, preferably ground chuck when flavor matters. This is the weekday workhorse. Chuck roast wins the slow cooking category, but ground beef wins speed. If you have 20 minutes and a pound of ground beef, dinner is not far away. Burgers, tacos, chili, meatballs, bolognese casseroles, stuffed peppers, meatloaf, skillet meals, fillings, and quick stir-fry style dishes all start from the same basic package. That is why I consider it essential. It removes the excuse to buy a freezer full of specialized convenience meats. The important part is understanding the lean to fat ratio. For a juicy burger, around 80% lean and 20% fat is the classic target. Fat carries flavor and gives the patty some protection against drying out. 90% lean and 10% fat can be useful for dishes where you want less rendered fat, but it is much easier to make a dry burger with it. There's nothing wrong with lean beef when the recipe calls for it. And the mistake is thinking leaner automatically means better for every job. Read the label and match the blend to the meal. Ground beef also freezes extremely well when you package it intelligently. Instead of tossing a giant family pack into the freezer as one brick, divide it into portions around 1 pound, roughly 450 grams. Put each portion into a freezer bag, press it flat, remove as much air as you reasonably can, label it with the date, and stack the packages like files. A flat package freezes faster, stacks better, and thaws much faster than a thick lump. And if you own a grinder or grinder attachment, buying chuck roast on sale and grinding it at home can give you fresher ground beef and more control over fat content. It can also save money when the whole roast is priced below pre-ground beef, though that depends on the store and the week. The point is to compare, not assume. Ground beef replaces almost every processed convenience protein people buy because they think they need variety. Frozen burger patties, pre-seasoned taco meat, meatball mixes, many skillet kits, and chopped beef products can all be built from one basic package with ingredients you already have. That means fewer specialized packages, fewer half-used products, and less money sitting in the freezer. The third essential category is where I let people have some fun. For that job, I would choose ribeye. Ribeye earns the spot because its marbling gives you both flavor and forgiveness. Those thin veins of intramuscular fat melt as the steak cooks, keeping the meat juicy and giving it the deep beef richness people associate with a great steakhouse meal. But if you are only keeping one premium steak in your buying plan, I would rather spend on a cut that gives you maximum flavor than spread that money across filet, strip, T-bone, and whatever else was marketed as special that week. Ribeye cooks beautifully over high, dry heat. A very hot grill or cast iron pan works. Season simply with salt and pepper. Sear both sides, control the internal temperature, and for many people, medium rare gives the best balance of rendered fat and tenderness. Then rest it before slicing so the juices settle. For thick ribeyes, reverse searing is another excellent method. Bring the internal temperature up gently first, then finish with an aggressive sear. But here is the part that saves money. You do not always need ribeye itself to get a ribeye-like experience. Look for chuck eye steak. Chuck eye sits right next to the rib section on the animal, which is why it shares some of the same flavor and tenderness characteristics. But because it carries the chuck name instead of ribeye, it is often much cheaper. People call it the poor man's ribeye for a reason. Cook chuck the same general way you would cook ribeye: high heat, simple seasoning, careful doneness, and a proper rest. It may not be identical to the center of a premium ribeye, but for the money, it can come remarkably close to the experience. And this is where the 3-cut system begins to make sense. Chuck roast covers slow and moist cooking. Ground beef covers fast, chopped cooking. Ribeye or chuck eye covers high heat, steak cooking. 3 categories, 3 jobs, most of what a family actually needs from beef. In the next part, I want to show you why the rest of the meat case is usually optional and how to turn these 3 cuts into an entire week of meals without feeling like you are eating the same thing over and over. The point is not restriction. It is building a smaller buying system that still gives you comfort food, fast dinners, and a proper steak when you want one. Once you understand the 3 jobs, the meat counter gets much easier to read. The problem with buying 10 or 12 different cuts is not that variety is bad. Variety is enjoyable. The problem is when variety turns into impulse. You buy a filet because it looks luxurious, A T-bone because the bone looks impressive, a tomahawk because it photographs well, a trendy butcher cut because everybody online is talking about it. And then you still buy ground beef chuck and some kind of steak because those are the things you actually know how to cook. That is how the freezer fills with money instead of meals. The point of stop buying the rest is not that you should never eat another cut. It means stop treating every cut like a necessity. Start with 3 workhorses, then buy the others only when you have a specific reason. Filet mignon is a perfect example. It is incredibly tender because the tenderloin does very little work, but it is also lean and mild compared with ribeye. If tenderness is your priority, filet can be worth every dollar to you. But if what you really want is deep beef flavor, ribeye usually gives you more of what you are chasing. T-bone is another cut people buy, partly because of the experience. You get strip on one side and tenderloin on the other, separated by the bone. That is fun, but the two muscles cook differently, and you pay for the presentation and the bone weight as well as the meat. And tomahawk takes that idea even further. The long rib bone looks dramatic, but the edible muscle is still ribeye. If you love the show, buy it for the show. Just do not confuse presentation with necessity. New York strip can be excellent, but if you already have ribeye or chuck eye as your steak category, strip becomes optional. The same is true for many expensive butcher cuts that became fashionable because chefs discovered them. Hanger, bavette, skirt, flat iron, terrace major, and similar cuts can all be wonderful. I enjoy them. But once the market discovers a former bargain, prices rise, and the whole reason people called it a secret can disappear. They become fun purchases, not essential weekly purchases. A chuck roast can often be cut into stew meat, braised, shredded, sliced, or ground. Ground beef can become more dishes than most people cook in a month. Ribeye or chuck eye handles the special steak night. If another cut cannot do something meaningfully different for your household, ask why you are buying it. That one question eliminates a lot of impulse purchases. This brings us to another butcher principle. Match the cut to the method before you match the cut to the recipe name. Recipes make meat sound more specialized than it is. One recipe says beef stew, another says shredded beef tacos, another says braised beef sandwiches. You may assume you need 3 cuts. You do not. Chuck roast can handle all 3 because the underlying cooking job is the same. Long cooking with enough moisture and time to break down collagen. Once you recognize the method, the ingredient list gets simpler. And steak night is one category too. You do not need filet, strip, porterhouse, T-bone, ribeye, and tomahawk in the freezer at the same time to prove you like steak. Pick the one that gives you the experience you value most. For me, that is ribeye. And when value matters, chuck eye. There's also a practical money advantage in buying larger pieces and dividing them yourself. When whole chuck roasts or family packs of ground beef are priced well, portioning at home can save around $1 to $2 per pound compared with smaller convenience packages in some stores. That is not a guaranteed national number, so compare your local shelf. The principle is what matters. Convenience costs money. Somebody has to cut, tray, wrap, label, and merchandise every smaller package. When you do some of that work yourself, you can keep more of the value. Buy the larger chuck roast, cut part into stew cubes, leave part as a roast, and grind a portion if you have the equipment. Buy the large ground beef pack, divide it into 1-pound portions, flatten, date, freeze. If ribeye goes on a strong sale, buy a larger piece or a few steaks only if you know you will use them. You are not trying to build a museum of frozen beef. You are building a rotation. Another reason these 3 cuts work so well is that they teach the 3 most important beef cooking methods. Chuck teaches patience. Ground beef teaches heat management and seasoning. Ribeye teaches searing and doneness. Learn those 3, and you become a much better cook across the entire meat case. With chuck, you learn that tough does not mean bad. It means the collagen has not been given enough time. You learn to judge tenderness with a fork or probe instead of assuming the clock is always right. With ground beef, you learn that overcrowding a pan creates steam instead of browning. Cook in batches if needed. Let the meat make contact with a hot surface before constantly stirring it. Salt appropriately for the dish. If you are making burgers, handle the meat lightly so you do not compress it into a dense puck. If you are making meatballs or meatloaf, then binders and seasoning change the texture on purpose. One ingredient, different technique. With ribeye or chuck eye, you learn to respect marbling. Pat the surface dry. Use enough heat to create a crust. Rest the steak. And when you slice, cut across the grain where practical. That last point matters with many cuts because long muscle fibers make meat feel chewier. Shorten those fibers with a knife and the bite improves. Now let us turn this into an actual week. because a system is useless if it sounds clever but does not help at dinner. Imagine you shop on Saturday, you buy 1 chuck roast, a family pack of ground chuck, and either 2 ribeyes or 2 chuck eye steaks, depending on the budget. Sunday is the slow day. Season the chuck roast, braise it with onions and stock, and serve it as pot roast with vegetables. Do not eat all of it. Save a meaningful portion. Monday can be ground beef night, burgers, meatballs, or a quick skillet dish. Tuesday, take that leftover chuck and shred it into tacos or burritos. Add salsa, onions, maybe some rice or beans, and nobody at the table feels like they are eating Sunday dinner again. Wednesday, use another ground beef portion for bolognese, chili, or a casserole. Thursday can be leftovers or something that is not beef at all. That matters too. A smart meat plan does not mean eating beef 7 nights a week. Friday or Saturday becomes steak night. That is when the ribeye or chuck eye earns its place. You have spent less all week because the everyday meals came from 2 flexible cuts, so the special steak feels intentional instead of impulsive. If there is leftover chuck, portion it and freeze it for a future week. If ground beef is still in the freezer, it is already divided and ready. That is a working system. One more practical habit makes the system work even better. Decide your portions before the meat reaches the freezer. If the chuck is for 2 meals, divide it before freezing. If the ground beef is for burgers and sauce, make separate packages for each job. If the steak is for Saturday, wrap those pieces individually. That prevents you from thawing more meat than you need and then feeling forced to cook it before it turns. A simple plan at the cutting board saves more money than a fancy sale sign ever will. What would your 3-meat week look like? Pot roast, tacos, burgers, chili, steak. Tell me your lineup in the comments, because I guarantee different families can build completely different menus from the same 3 purchases. A 3-cut plan reverses the usual supermarket habit. You walk in knowing the jobs you need filled. Slow cooked beef, chuck, fast everyday beef, ground chuck, steak, ribeye, or chuck eye. Everything else has to justify itself. Maybe short ribs are on a phenomenal sale and you have a braise planned. Fine. Maybe your family loves skirt steak fajitas and you know you are cooking them Friday. Buy it. Maybe filet is for an anniversary. Great. The difference is that those are deliberate exceptions, not the foundation of your shopping. That is what stop buying the rest really means. It means make every extra cut earn its way into the cart. The real value comes from buying a cut whose method you understand and whose leftovers you will actually use. Chuck roast is valuable because 1 cook can become several meals. Ground beef is valuable because it turns into dinner quickly and freezes well. Ribeye or chuck eye is valuable because it satisfies the special steak category, so you stop chasing 5 other premium steaks. 3 cuts, 3 jobs, 1 simple system. And there is a final butcher lesson behind all of it. Flavor does not live on a price tag. Working muscles can be incredibly flavorful. Tender muscles can be expensive but mild. Fat, connective tissue, grain, and cooking method matter more than prestige. A chuck roast cooked patiently can give you a depth and richness a quick-cooked tenderloin never will. And a proper 80-20 burger can make ultra-lean ground beef taste disappointing. A well-marbled chuck eye can embarrass a poorly marbled expensive steak. Once you understand that, the meat counter stops being a hierarchy from cheap to premium. It becomes a toolbox. You do not need every tool every week. You need the right tools for the work you actually do. So next time you shop, try this once. Build the cart around chuck roast, ground beef, and ribeye or chuck eye. Portion them properly. Plan the week before you buy the extras. Then look at everything else and ask one question. What job does this cut do that my 3 cannot do well enough? If you have a real answer, buy it. If you do not, leave it. That one habit can reduce waste, simplify your freezer, and keep more money in your pocket without making dinner boring. The goal is not less enjoyment, it is more purpose. 3 cuts are enough to cover most of the beef meals a household cooks because they cover the 3 methods that matter most. Slow and moist, fast and chopped, hot and dry. Everything else is choice. And once choice stops pretending to be necessity, buying meat gets a whole lot simpler.